Okay, APUSH part 2. So again, this is part 2 of the World War II home front. So a lot of historians actually look at the World War II home front, look at this period of time and say World War II itself is a racial war, right? So you have not only lots of different races involved in World War II because it is a global conflict, but it's also largely motivated by race. I mean, look at Hitler, right? In his treatment of the Jews, the Aryan race, his obsession with that. And we know that totalitarian dictators, especially fascists, we talked about how they're obsessed with ideas about racial superiority. And so a lot of historians characterize World War II in general as a racially motivated war. And it's interesting because if you look at the American home front, even though that's not part of technically the war outside, within the country itself, we see a reflection of that racial war as well. And so I want to look at a couple of different groups, race groups within the United States, and kind of their treatment and how the war affects them on the home front, while so many other races are being affected outside the war as well. So the first group that I want to look at, the first group, extra toasty is the way to go. The first group that I want to look at is African Americans, okay? Because again, African Americans, they have some new opportunities, just like women, that are open to them during this war. Some of them go into new industries that we talked about, right? Especially in the South, so they have new manufacturing jobs. They move into those. You do have a lot of African Americans that actually fight overseas, and so they're put in segregated regiments and they're fighting overseas, especially in Europe. And so at home, African Americans see the contributions that they're making to the war effort, and they hear FDR every day talk about bringing freedom of choice and freedom of fear and freedom of want and all these different freedoms to people all over the world. And African Americans are kind of scratching their head like, this is the most hypocritical thing ever, right? Now, why would it be the most hypocritical thing ever? Because FDR is fighting a war of freedom, right? Remember in his State of the Union address, he says, I'm fighting for all of these 4 freedoms. But African Americans are largely exempt from that, right? They're not a part of those freedoms. That's not a part of what FDR is fighting for. And so African Americans largely call America out on this hypocrisy, right? They say we deserve a double V, not just a victory in this war, but a victory for discriminated groups within the United States too. We want a victory from segregation. And so you have all of these new protests and sit-ins and different events in order to try to bring about awareness about ending segregation. Now, this is important because not only is this message a consistent message that we've been talking about for a while now. Remember that question of how is it that we're going to end segregation within the United States? And we've talked about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, and we talked about the Harlem Renaissance and Marcus Garvey and all of these different ways that African Americans have attempted to answer that question. Well, here's your next way that they're attempting to ask it and answer it. And here's where it's really important and significant, because you have a new group that comes about called the Congress of Racial Equality. They're founded in 1942. They want to bring an end to segregation. This is an African American organization, but their answer to ending segregation is we're going to do it through nonviolent protest. So we're going to do it through sit-ins, and we're going to do it through a peaceful message of nonviolence. Again, in order to bring an end to segregation. Now, why is this important? We know that segregation lasts a considerable amount of time after this, another 20, 25 years. This is the organization that brings those ideas to the forefront of the minds of later, like a Martin Luther King Jr., right? So this idea of nonviolent protest, of civil disobedience. This group, CORE, that's founded in World War II, they later influenced the civil rights leaders who actually used those tactics, and we know bring an end to segregation for good in 1965. And so that's why it's really important. The African American response to World War II is going to influence later the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Mexican Americans also play a significant role in the World War II home front. And this is a group that we haven't talked about largely up until this time, because during World War II, you need food, right? We've talked about rationing and conservation and victory gardens that women are making in their backyards. But you need more than that, right? All of your farmers are now fighting overseas. And so you need farmers, right? And so the United States actually reaches out to Mexico during World War II and says, hey, you're an agricultural agricultural community, can you send us farmers? This is called the Bracero Program, where the U.S. partners with Mexico, and Mexico actually sends us 4.5 million farmers to come farm the American West during World War II while American farmers are away. Now, after the war, some of them go home, but many of them actually stay in the United States because they've been there for a while and they've made a life there. So now you kind of have this sudden influx of Mexican Americans living in the West for largely the first time. And we know what happens in America when you have a sudden influx of an immigrant group, right? Americans respond usually with nativism, a fear of immigrants. And this is no exception to that. The best example of Mexican American discrimination during World War II is something called the Zoot suit riots, okay? Zoot suits, and you can see on the PowerPoint, they're these kind of like baggy suits that were fashionable among Mexican Americans, and even African Americans wore a lot of Zoot suits as well during the Harlem Renaissance. They just called them a different name. And you can again see them on the pictures on the PowerPoint, but it was a distinguishing trait, a distinguishing fashion trend among Mexican Americans. And so you have these kind of like intoxicated sailors, white sailors in LA, kind of walking the streets of 1943, and they come across some Mexican Americans who are wearing these Zoot suits, and they start poking around with them and teasing and mocking them. And before you know it, a fight breaks out. It turns into an all-out brawl, like a mob, and the police have to come and break it up again on the streets of LA. Even though the white sailors were the ones that started this brawl, it's the Mexican Americans wearing the Zoot suits that end up having to go to jail. They're the ones who are arrested. The victims become kind of like the offenders in the eyes of the police. These are called the Zoot suit riots, kind of again named after the fashion trend, and this is the best example of Mexican American discrimination and nativism that we see happening throughout World War II. So African Americans, Mexican Americans, both of them play big roles, significant roles in changing the American home front during the war. The last and probably most significant, though, minority group that has a significant role in the home front is of course Japanese Americans. And you can imagine the predicament that they are faced with after Pearl Harbor, right? You have all kinds of fear surrounding this people group, especially along the West Coast. Americans are just convinced that Japanese Americans are working with the Japanese government, that there are spies amidst them, that there's going to be an attack in California. So you have all of this fear and paranoia, largely again on the West Coast, surrounding the treatment of Japanese Americans. And so West Coast leaders, politicians in California and Oregon and even in Washington, they start putting a lot of pressure on FDR. Like, hey, we have all of these Japanese Americans living amongst us. We know their high sense of national honor. We just know that they have to be spies. Now, this is not true. But these politicians put so much pressure on FDR that he ends up signing something called Executive Order 9066. One of those things in American history that you just absolutely have to know. And unfortunately is largely not taught in our textbooks. Your guys' textbook has like maybe a paragraph on it. Mine had a few sentences, but a lot of textbooks prior to the 1960s had largely no mention of Japanese internment at all. Executive Order 9066 wasn't a well-known thing. It wasn't taught in schools. And so that's changing, but it's important that we talk about it because it is one of the more embarrassing parts of our history. And so Executive Order 9066 basically said that there was going to be 10 war zones scattered throughout the West and the Midwest, and that Japanese Americans were going to be detained, removed from their communities, and brought to these 10 war zones to live for the duration of the war. So we call these war zones internment camps. There's pictures on your slides in your PowerPoint presentation, but they basically look like military barracks. They're public facilities, shared facilities. And so Japanese Americans, they hear knocks on the door. The military's there basically saying, listen, you have 2 days to evacuate your home and go to one of these internment camps to stay until the war is over. Now they tell them it's for their protection, that they don't want them to be harassed or discriminated against. They don't want them to be targeted. But in reality, it's really generated by this fear of a Japanese attack on the West Coast. And so these Japanese Americans, many of who were born in the United States, They have businesses, they have extended family there, they have connections to their community. They're ripped from those communities and then again put in these internment camps until the war is over. There's really no telling when they're going to be home. At that point, it seems like the war could go on for a long time longer. This is in 1943 when this program starts. And so you do have a Japanese American who fights against this. His name is Korematsu in 1944. He brings this to the U.S. Supreme Court and says, listen, this isn't fair. Like, this should be against our Constitution. You can't just take away my home and put me in an internment camp against my will and tell me I can't go home until the war is over. But unfortunately, because of the fear and the paranoia, and because rules are kind of gray during wartime, the U.S. Supreme Court says, nope, this executive order is absolutely constitutional, and Korematsu loses that case. That means that hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans are in these 10 internment camps, most of them until about 1946. So even though the war ends in 1945, it's another year or so before they're able to actually go home. And unfortunately, when they go home, they find that they've lost everything. So the government promised when they left, oh, we'll watch your businesses, we'll watch your cars, your homes. And that just doesn't happen. They come home to nothing, and they basically have to completely start back over. While living in these internment camps, again, these are public facilities. There's a lot of overcrowding issues. Usually you would have a family of 4 that would share kind of one room, one space. But even the military barracks that they stayed in, sometimes you would have multiple families, up to 25 families sharing the same space. Shared hygiene, restroom facilities, shared kitchen facilities. And the internment camps, they kind of acted as their own towns. So they would have a school, they would have a factory that Japanese Americans would go and work at during the day. They had their own post office, they'd have a church there, a grocery store, which again kind of functions as a community. But remember, these people can't leave, right? And so it's not like they can go out to a different facility or a different school. Everything is there in the internment camp, not for convenience, but because they are unable to leave. It functions kind of as a mini prison. And what's so amazing about this is you would think there'd be a lot of backlash. Aside from Korematsu, the Japanese Americans, they go along with it because they feel like, again, that sense of national honor, not to Japan, but to the United States. They feel like, if we go along with this and we go to these camps and we do what's asked of us, we're going to prove our loyalty, not as Japanese citizens, but as American citizens. And so you really don't have a lot of uprisings or revolts or insurrections happening in the camps. Japanese Americans largely go along with this peacefully because they feel like by doing that, they're going to prove their loyalty. So just atrocious things happen during this period. And unfortunately, there's no really recourse to stop it, not in the government or in the camps themselves. This is incredibly ironic during World War II that it happens during this period, because we know what happens in Europe, right, with the Holocaust and concentration camps. Now, you don't have mass genocide happening in these internment camps in the United States, but in terms of the infringement of rights, there's a lot of eerie similarities between what's happening in Nazi Germany and the Holocaust and that same source of fear that's generating and producing these internment camps in the United States with Japanese Americans. So a really sad part of our history that unfortunately has been overlooked for a long period of time. It was about a year ago that the Supreme Court reviewed the Korematsu case and actually said, oh, we shouldn't have done that. That was a mistake on our part. And so they reversed that decision. And so internment camps are illegal now in the United States. And so, but that again was a really recent development. This is something that as a country we're still largely learning about and kind of atoning for decades and decades later after the war ended. So anyways, long lecture. You guys hung in there. If you have any questions, make sure that you, of course, submit them to me and then we can talk about it. Wash your hands. I miss you all. And I hope you're staying healthy. Talk to you soon.